is to enthuse you about lichens, about which some of you, I know, because there are familiar faces in the audience, some of you already know quite a lot. But even those who think they've heard this talk several times before, there is some new stuff in it. So stay with me, stay with me. Others of you will probably know absolutely nothing about lichens, so I will be starting from the beginning and will introduce them to you, what they are, where you find them, and I'll just say now before I forget actually, some people I know really don't want to know what these things are called, especially given that they all have Latin names. But there are others in the audience who I know really do like to be able to put names to things. So I have tried all the way through this talk to just put in small print the name of the lichen all the way through. So for those of you who don't care what they're called, just ignore all of that. They're all unpronounceable anyway. Right, so the curious world of lichens. Why on earth did I call this that? I am no lichen expert. Let's make that clear for a start. I'm a lichen enthusiast. So I'm not a taxonomist. I'm not red hot on identification. I don't spend 16 hours a day looking at spores down a microscope. I leave that to other people who are much better at it than I am. But I am increasingly enthusiastic about them. And the more I find out, the more curious I think these organisms are. They really are very strange, and it is a bit of a mystery how they actually work, how on earth they can survive and do well. So, that's me, being Alice, looking in my collecting box thinking, I wish I hadn't picked that one up, I have no idea what it is. So for me, just a little bit about me, it all started here. It started with the Observer's Book of Lichens. Not that edition, because that edition only came out in 1977, and I actually got started a few years before that, I confess. Don't try and work it out. I was quite young. I grew up in Sussex, and Sussex has an absolute wonderful array of old, really old rural churches. And my mother is very keen on old Sussex churches. She knows a great deal about them. She studied the architecture and the history. And so even as a child, I was being taken around from ancient church to ancient church, and I tended to get bored with the inside, so I started wandering around the churchyards, and very quickly discovered that actually there was more going on out in the churchyard usually than there was inside church. And they are wonderful places, these little churchyards. They are full of, amongst other things, lichens. And at that time, we're going back to when I was a teenager here, very little was known about what was where, where they were, what they were, how they were interacting with each other and with the environment. It was all a bit of a mystery. So I had to do a school project, an A-level biology project, and Mum and I very quickly came up with this plan that we would study the churchyard lichens of our part of Sussex. And we started here. This is Coombs Church near Shoreham, where I grew up. And we had a lovely summer going around all these churchyards, she looking at the churches, me looking at the lichens, and I did my project on them, and that's the project. And the project was good enough that it got me a place in university where I read natural sciences. So it all came out very well in the end. And I've been interested on and off in lichens ever since. So there's my little biography, starting with a career change, because you don't want to know about what happened before then. That was boring. But it paid off the mortgage. So yes, I did a PhD here at Newcastle on Calmanair in grassland. That's the habitats contaminated by lead mining back in the day. I've been a lifelong learning tutor, been a lecturer at Newcastle, recently retired. I'm still doing a lot of research. That gives you an idea of the sorts of things. Gordon mentioned the sill roof and various other things. And I've been heavily involved in the British Lichen Society for about the last 30 years. For the last 25 of those years, I've been managing their database of records. So that's my big spare time occupation, if you like. I took it on for 2 years. 25 years later, there's still nobody else willing to do it. You know how it is. So, let's just get a few of the thorny questions out of the way first. Is it lichen or lichen? It's always the first question that comes up. These days we pronounce it lichen. So it's derived from the Greek word meaning the one who licks. I don't quite understand that, because if there's one thing lichens don't do, it's lick. However, there it is. So these days we call it lichen, but back in the time when this book was published, it was always pronounced the trouble with lichen. And some of you may remember this. It's going back to 1960. And it had a fascinating theme, actually. If you've never read it, it's a bit of science fiction. It's a really good read. And it was all about the secret to prolonging life using a chemical derived from lichens. And it got to be a bit political, because I think this was the first, and until very recently, the only time that lichens got their nose into politics a little bit. So it was thought that by slowing the ageing process so everybody could live indefinitely, that would mean that women would no longer have to choose between career and children. Well, we've solved that problem now. We're all expected to do both. So that was the first little bit of politics. And very recently, lichens got involved in politics again. So just mentioned this one. This was Just Stop Oil. I think was it earlier this year. They decided to paint Stonehenge orange. Stonehenge is a very important lichen site. Those stones have been there for 3,500 years. They're dripping with lichens. At least 116 species being recorded on them, and that's without being able to get up to the tops. There are some real rarities on there, and surprisingly several maritime species. I'll leave you to speculate as to how they may have got there. Fortunately, the people from Just Stop Oil, I think, were aware of this, because they made quite sure that although there was an awful lot of orange pigment flying around, it was dry pigment, and in fact most of it was cornflower, which really does no harm to anything. They did it on a hot sunny day, and so yes, it got onto the lichens, but English Heritage were well prepared for such action, and they knew what to do, and they came in with the equivalent of hairdryers and blew the powder off again, off the lichens, so there was no harm done, I'm glad to say. So that's it for the politics. Lichens generally do not get involved in politics. Okay, so what is a lichen? I'm sorry, there's going to be a few diagrams now, because it's really the only way to explain these things. A lichen is basically a fungus. What you see when you look at a lichen, visual aid, a lichen, very often grey in colour, or greyish, sort of maybe greenish grey, a lot of them. And that's because they are basically fungi. What you see is fungus. And if you think of the colour of a mushroom, basically the colour of a lichen is very similar. But inside it are algae, algal cells, which are shown in green there. And the algae do what plants do. They photosynthesize. They can use sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to make sugars and that's the basis of our food chain. It's also the basis of the lichens food chain. So the fungi can't photosynthesize, but the algae can. And it's called a symbiotic association because they are working in very close harmony. More of that in a moment. There's about 17,000 species worldwide. Some people think it's 20,000. Basically, there's an awful lot of them still sitting in herbaria, unidentified, so we don't really know. There's more than 2,000 species in Britain alone, which can be a challenge for identification. So there you go, there's a representation of what it is. So the mycobiont, as we call it, the fungal component, is an ascomycete fungus, so it's not the same sort of fungi as mushrooms and toadstools. It's like the sac fungi, Pisiza and things like that. The algae may actually be algae or cyanobacteria. They both take the form of green slime when they live in standalone. Quite familiar, they're the things you slip on the pavement. Put the two together and you end up with something completely different. So it's completely different in form, colour, function, and particularly in where it can live. Both of those, sac fungi and algae, are quite restricted in where they can live on their own. Put the two together and they become the ultimate stress tolerators. They can cope with almost anything. And we find them anywhere that the one thing that they can't cope with is competition. So competition from plants, particularly, and from mosses. They outgrow them, they swamp them, they can't cope with that. But anywhere that plants and moss can't grow, lichens will. On all continents, Antarctica, almost to the top of Everest, absolutely everywhere. So fence posts, trees, rocks are the classic places. There's a few others, you get them on twigs. Paving slabs, the one top in the middle, this is paving. Those white splodges that you see on footpaths, that's a lichen, Lichenora muralis. The ones that you see particularly around the university where you think, oh, the students have been dropping bubble gum again or chewing gum on the pavement again. Actually, if you look closely at it, it's Fischiacesia, it's a lichen. They love churchyards, of course. This actually isn't my car, because I've only had my car for a couple of years and the lichens aren't very well developed on it yet. But they're beginning. You'll even get the lichens on your car. This is the rear light of a car close up. And a couple of species of lichens getting nicely established on there. So anywhere where there's no competition, they can cope with the rest. So you get them all over the place. Even in the edge of the sea, in the littoral zone, on the beach. Limpets, so the brown at the top there, with black dots in it, that's a lichen on that limpet. This is a limpet that I picked up from Cocotte Island, from the beach at Cocotte Island. It's got loads of barnacles on it, living barnacles, and the barnacles also have, you see these black dots, another lichen actually growing in their shells. So salt water, no problem. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Great variety of colours and growth forms. We have names for some of these growth forms, which I'll run through in a moment. Quite a nice illustration, that one, but really this is just an excuse to show you that one, which I think is gorgeous. I love this. You can buy this as a poster, apparently. It's not actually very accurate, but it is beautiful. So just to show you a few of these growth forms, excuse me, because this will come up later as we go through. So leprose is the simplest. It's just an unstructured jumble of fungus and alga. Very simple as that. Got no protective layers, got nothing really going on. It's not even fertile, it doesn't even produce spores. You will have seen this, you may not have noticed it, but you will have seen it at the bases of trees and the damps or crevices in walls and at the base of buildings. Quite common area in Ghana. Crustose lichens are a little bit more sophisticated. They've got a protective upper layer, they've got a top to them, but they're actually growing in this case in stone. If they're on trees, they're growing in the very top layer of the bark. So all we can see is the upper surface. You can't lift them, you can't get a knife underneath them. If you want to take a sample, it's a hammer and chisel job. So we call those crustose, they're crusts, very common. Those white splodges that you see on dry stone walls, crustose lichens. The ones that people notice much more are the bigger foliose lichens. They're leafy, they've got a top and a bottom to them, so we call them two-dimensional. You can get a knife underneath them and lift them off. Some of them even have rhizines, like roots, to attach them to the substrate. And then fruticose are more sophisticated still. Fruticose lichens on a twig here for you. This is Usnea. If you go up to somewhere like Kielder or the west coast of Scotland, you'll see a lot of these lovely fruticose lichens. They have a bit of a problem, the fruticose lichens, because they've got a very high surface area to volume ratio. In other words, they've got an awful lot of surface and very little volume there in which to do everything that lichens do, basically. And I'll come to talking about pollution in a little while, but these filamentous or fruticose lichens are very vulnerable to pollution, which is why you do not get them in Newcastle. You do not get them really anywhere near to towns. You know, you have to go quite a long way out before you find those. As I say, Kielder's a great place for them. There's also a very strange growth form that nobody can define called cladoniform. It's only in one genus of lichens called cladonia. Those are all species of cladonia. There are about 60 species in this country. And yeah, I mean, if you just saw two of them, you'd be hard pushed to say that they even belong to the same genus. They are very variable. The nice ones, the good ones, have these red fruits up at the top. So that's cladoniform. I should apologise for using Latin names all the way through, except that I don't think I should apologise, because the English names are a real problem. This list is hopelessly out of date. There are many more names. Now, what happens is people do feel obliged nowadays to use English names for things, and a lot of books and websites and that do try to use them. The trouble is there are no standardised names, so people just make them up. And, Hypergymnea physodes, right? That very common lichen is shown on the left there. It's grey, foliose thing, occurs on walls, occurs on trees. This was, the red box there shows you some of the names that had already been defined by about 20 years ago. The list now would be much, much longer. And some of them make no sense at all. I mean, monk's hood lichen, it's not even hooded. There is another grey one that does have hoods, but that's not it. Heather rags, well, it does grow a lot on heather, but it grows an awful lot on other things as well. And it is quite difficult to make much sense of these English names. So, lichenologists try not to use English names, and I'm sorry about that. You soon get used to the Latin. You have to. Right, a little bit of biology for you. I'll try not to go too deep into this because it does actually get rather boring. I said that your lichen is primarily a fungus with algae in it. And the problem is the fungi cannot photosynthesize. None of them can. They don't do it. So they all fungi have to get their energy, their carbon, their sugars, their proteins, whatever, from something else that has already done the photosynthesizing. So a lot of fungi are saprophytes, decomposers of dead plants and animals. Anybody recognise the fungus top left on the ceiling in the big market? Yeah, one or two of you do. It's the dreaded dry rot. If you ever get that in your house, you're in trouble. It's a beautiful thing. Some fungi are parasites, so they just take advantage of living organisms but without giving anything back. Rust fungi on grass is my example there. If you want to get a bit more personal, think of athlete's foot. Parasitic fungus. And then there's mutualists, and these are the ones that I'm interested in, which form these very close partnerships with other organisms. So mycorrhizal fungi with trees, lichens, seaweeds. They're in seaweeds as well. They're in all sorts of things. So mutualistic symbiosis is what we call it now. So there you go, there's another diagram showing the same thing. Mutualism is where both partners benefit from the arrangement. So one is not really taking advantage of the other, so it can be stable, it can last for years, so long as they stay in balance. Parasitism, one partner benefits but the other is harmed by the arrangement. And there's also commensalism, where one partner benefits and the other is completely unaffected and oblivious to it. And the example there is a bird in a tree. The bird is benefiting from the tree couldn't care less. And as I say, there's lots of examples of mutualism, not all of them involving fungi. Clownfish and sea anemones. Ants and aphids was a good one. I don't know what the woolly bat and the pitcher plant do to each other. I'm not into that. So our fungi in the lichens, there are these ascomycete fungi, these sac fungi. And they're called sac fungi because they produce their spores in a sac called an ascus, hence ascomycetes. Basidiomycetes, the toadstools, separated off from the sac fungi a very long time ago, 500 million years or more ago. So these are two very separate evolutionary paths. The algae can and do live independently, but once they go into a lichen, they change. Once they're taken up into a lichen, they change, the cells become larger, the cell walls become thinner, they become real photosynthetic factories. They're just pumping out sugars, and the fungus is there, happy to receive them. The fungus does everything else in exchange. It provides full housekeeping services. So it manages water relations for the algae, it manages the supply of gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, in and out, protects them from ultraviolet damage, protects them from grazing animals, and even disposes of their waste products. So the fungus is providing full hotel services. Right? And that's a section through a lichen. In this case, it's got a protective layer at the top, an algal layer below, a medulla with air spaces, another, this is foliose, so it's got a lower cortex as well, and rhizines to attach it to its substrate. So far so good. That's what it looks like from an algal cell's point of view. It's got these fungal hyphae all around it, clamped onto the outside of the cell, taking the sugars. That's a real world section through, and it is actually quite interesting. The upper layer and the lower layer, in fact, are hygroscopic, so they will take up water. They actually have a sort of a gel between the fungal hyphae which absorbs water, soaks it up, like a sponge. But the bit in the middle, the medulla, and the bit where the algal cells are, the fungi have a water repellent, a hydrophobic coating to them. So that stops the medulla becoming waterlogged, and it ensures that there is actually oxygen and carbon dioxide getting to the algal cells. So, it's quite clever. Lichens need a very regular cycle of wetting and drying. They, the term is poikilohydric, if you're wondering how you say that. Poikilohydric. Basically, they don't retain water as we do. No, we have to maintain very carefully our water balance, and as soon as we are a bit lacking in water, we have to take some more in, which is why a lot of us these days carry water bottles. Very different in lichens, they just dry out. They're quite happy to just dry out. Actually, drying out protects them from being invaded by other fungi and bacteria and the rest. So they dry out, they go down to about 28% water content, which is really very low. They become hard and brittle, and I've got specimens here that have dried, and believe me, they are absolutely hard, and they're very brittle, very easy to break. As soon as there's water, not really rainfall usually, but dew or mist, they take that up, and very quickly that upper layer becomes soft, it becomes flexible, it becomes translucent, which lets the light through to the algae beneath. And within a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes of a good dew falling, the lichen is off. It's active, it's growing, it's doing everything it needs to do. And if it was a morning dew or a morning mist, that's when it becomes active and the algae start photosynthesizing. And that active period, even in Britain, very often only lasts for about 15 or 20 minutes. Quite short, because then the sun comes onto the lichen and it all starts drying out again and it becomes dormant. Yeah, pretty good. Pretty neat, I think. A couple of terms that I'll put them in because I may accidentally use them while we're talking. Some lichens have structures called decidia, little finger-like projections. We have no idea what they're for, but they have them. They're very helpful in identification. Some lichens have cilia, these hair-like structures on the edges. Very good looking. Lovely teloschistes on the left there. No idea what they're for. Don't know. If you have any suggestions, let me know. Sometimes lichen thalli will merge, and I attempted to draw red lines around what started out as separate crustose lichens there. They're of the same species and they've just merged to form one big one. But very often, when lichens come up against each other, actually it's much more active than that. It's competition. They're competing for space all the time, these lichens. If they're folios, they're the big leafy ones, like the ones top right, then it's usually whoever grows fastest wins. They just grow over the top of each other. But the crustose ones are much more interesting, and there you can see this prothallus. You can see that. And that prothallus, that's where it's all happening. In that growing edge of the lichen, they're making all sorts of chemicals. And this is chemical warfare. These lichens are lobbing chemical weapons at each other, very slowly. Very slowly. but that's what they're doing. And it's called allelopathy. And these chemicals can inhibit the growth of their neighbour, or can even be toxic to it. So you've got two different situations there. Here you've got one where they're about quits, they've come up against each other and just stopped at the border. This one's a little bit different. These are three of the same species, and the one top left there, yes, you can see the mouse, is obviously winning because that's overgrowing its less vigorous colleague there. This one's trying to force its way in. It's doing quite well against the top right, but it's not doing so well against the top left. So you get all sorts of strange patterns happening and mosaics of these lichens. That prothallus and the colour of it, again, is very useful in identification. Some of those chemical weapons that they're lobbing around are actually quite interesting. They appear to have antibacterial properties, antifungal, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and possibly even anti-tumour agents in that they inhibit growth. So there's a lot of work being done on this at the moment, trying to isolate these compounds and find out what medicinal potential they might have for us. Waste disposal. Lichens, unlike plants, have no way of getting rid of toxins, waste products. They just stay inside the lichen. Sometimes they get secreted to the upper surface and form a layer, this calcium oxalate layer over the top. But usually they just get stored in those air spaces in the middle, which is why as the lichen gets older, you can often see bits of it start dying off in the middle, because it just becomes full of these toxic waste products. But it's growing from the edge, so it doesn't actually matter if it dies in the middle. How do they reproduce? I'm not going to go into this, mainly because I don't understand it. Reproduction in fungi is a complex subject. It's really weird, actually, but yeah. Suffice to say that in lichens they have asexual reproduction by fragmentation. Bits of them fall off, bits of them are designed to come off. But they also produce spores, and they produce two sorts of spores. They produce sexual spores and they produce asexual spores. The problem with the spores is that they are fungal spores only. The algae is not involved in this process. So fungal spore lands on something, it germinates, and it's got to find an algal partner to feed it, and it's got to find that partner quite quickly. We don't really know how long, but it's probably got a few days, no more. And that's not so easy because the algal partner that it needs may well not be there. The easiest way to find it is to land on top of another lichen with the same algal partner and pinch its algae. And you sometimes see lichens stacked up on top of each other where this is happening. The fragmentation takes the form of Ceridia and Ceralia. I'm sorry, these are slightly technical slides because I've used them in teaching students, and that's why I'm skipping through bits of them. Things that you probably don't want to know. So Ceridia, it's just a powder, it's a jumble of fungus and algae that breaks off, and it's very fine, flies through the air. You might think it's pollen grains, but actually very often it's lichen Ceridia. Spores are produced in these discs, which, if you've looked at lichens, you may well have noticed. The discs are usually coloured in some way, and they have a margin which may be of the same colour as the disc, or it may be of a different colour. These are crucial characters in identification. These apothecia, those spore-producing structures, come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Pinheads, squiggles, discs, pepper pots, that's just a few. So there you go, there's a little summary showing all the different bits of the lichen. So, we've talked about lichens as being fungus plus alga, and a little bit about how they work. Sometimes it's not an alga, it's a cyanobacterium, what we used to call a blue-green alga, which are also photosynthetic, but also they are nitrogen fixing, and this is a very useful thing for a lichen. Fine if the lichen only has one or the other, but if it has both, it has to structure itself to provide a different environment for the algae, which needs to be oxygen rich, and for the cyanobacteria, which needs to be anaerobic, oxygen poor. So you can get structures like this on the top of Peltitia leucophlebia, this little nodule on the top, lots of these little brown nodules there. So that's got the blue-greens in it, the cyanobacteria, and then the algae are down there in the medulla. Sometimes it's the other way up. This is Loberia, and this one has its cyanobacteria in nodules on the underside, and then the algae at the top. But it's got to keep the two apart. And then it gets more complicated still. This is where I start saying curiouser and curiouser, because it really does get quite weird actually. So there are also yeasts inside algae. Probably all of them, certainly all the ones that have been looked at so far, include yeast. They're a different type of fungus. Remember we had the sac fungi, and then that evolutionary line that had split off, that was the basidiomycetes, the toadstools and mushrooms. Well, yeasts go in with the toadstools and the mushrooms. So they're a completely different evolutionary line of fungus. And they're in there as well. And where are they? They're the green on these sections. So they're in the very outer layer of the cortex. Not quite sure what they do, but they certainly do something. Because you've got an example here of two very closely related species of Bryoria. They look rather different. Different colours, but they're also morphologically a bit different. Their DNA is identical for the fungus and for the algae. The difference is that one of them has got lots of yeast cells in it and the other one hasn't. And that's causing different genes to switch on and off in the fungi. Which then raises a question. We name lichens after the fungus because that's the main part of it. So do we call this one species or two? Is it the same species, two different forms? Or is it two different species? Tricky. How on earth do the yeasts get around from one lichen to another, and how do they colonise it? Nobody knows. What's their role in the symbiosis? We really don't know, but they seem to be doing quite a lot. This is fairly hot off the press. This has only been known for a few years, and it's still being researched. So that was yeasts, and then there's bacteria, and there might be viruses as well. They're both in there. They're in all these fungal symbioses. The bacteria are thought to contribute to nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, growth in various ways. They form a film on the outside of the hyphae, which may be protective, but we're not quite sure what it's protecting against. Maybe it's the bacteria that are stopping that medulla, that layer in the middle, from becoming waterlogged. They might be the water repellent bit. Maybe. As for the viruses, we haven't got a clue. So there you go, that's now the lichen symbiosis. And this is not what you were taught at school. So it's a fungus, plus an alga, or a cyanobacterium, or both, plus yeasts, plus bacteria, and maybe the viruses are in there somewhere as well. So it's really quite complex. It's quite weird. I'm going to keep, I know I'm running short of time, but I'm going to bash on just for a few more minutes if I may. Lichens crucial to the process of soil formation and the functioning of fresh soils, young soils, on brownfield sites or after glacier retreat, anything like that. I'm always asked, do they damage stone? Generally not. Generally they don't. However, they can be a bit of a problem on soft limestones and particularly on frescoes. If lichens get into frescoes, that's a bit of a problem because the lichen actually turns the fresco plaster to a layer of calcium oxalate, which is unhelpful. However, there are very few frescoes outdoors, so it's not a common problem. Do lichens interact with plants? Again, this is very recent research. Yes, they do. The lichens are secreting, if you've got a mat of lichens on the soil like that, they're secreting acids, arsenic acid especially, into the soil, and that is inhibiting the growth of mosses, it's inhibiting seedling growth, it's inhibiting the mycorrhizal fungi, and that is inhibiting plants as well. So basically they're keeping the ground clear for themselves. Fair enough. They also have positive effects as well, in that they feed, they're there. The sugars they secrete feed microorganisms. Lichens on trees are latched into the bark. The fungal hyphae are going through into the xylem, secreting acids into the xylem. That can move down to the roots, it can move up into the leaves, and it's thought it can inhibit photosynthesis. Whether it's enough to have any effect on a tree, I think is doubtful. But there's certainly quite a lot going on. One thing we do know is that when a tree dies, the lichens die with it. So the lichens are almost certainly getting something back from the tree as well. Nutrients or water or both. Right, I'm going to skip a chunk. Forgive me for this. Just to say, very quickly, lichens are sensitive to pollution. It used to be sulfur dioxide from burning coal, and Tyneside was the classic. It was called the lichen desert. There were no lichens on Tyneside until the Clean Air Act started cleaning things up. Sulfur dioxide is no longer a problem, which means that the pollution lichen, Lichen zioides, that came in from the sulfur springs in Iceland, did very well during the time of sulfur dioxide pollution. It filled the gaps, it was everywhere. That's gone again now, because other lichens are now re-invading as the air quality is improving. But we do have a problem with nitrogen. We have a problem with nitrogen oxides, particularly from diesel engines, and we have a problem with ammonia, particularly from poultry units, pig units and cattle. And we get this nitrophilous community, this orange and grey community of lichens, which is an indicator of high nitrogen levels, which is why I did want to just get to this bit, which is Lichen, a new app, only released a few weeks ago, produced by CEH and APIS. It's great fun. You can use this. There's a simple identification guide with it. There's a standard method you use. There's the field guide, the ID guide. It only looks at certain easily identifiable lichens. It's a smartphone app. You do your study, you look at your tree, you record what it's got on the branches, on the twigs and on the trunk, and the app will calculate for you a nitrogen score telling you whether you're in an area of high nitrogen pollution, moderate, low, or very low. It's great fun to do, and it's also actually really useful data. This sort of monitoring can be much more effective for something like nitrogen pollutants than putting up highly technical sensors, which tend to give you a very localised and short-term view of what's happening. So if you're interested in this, do download Lichen. It's on the Google Play Store, and there's an iPhone version as well, and have a bit of fun with it. And you get to miss the wonders of William Mudd. If you want to get into lichens, there is a book. That's the classic book that everybody in this country uses. Lichens by Frank Dobson is the ID book. But there is a new one. There's Lichens of Britain and Ireland, Lichens of Ireland and Britain, which has just come out. And there's another one, Lichens of Britain and Ireland, which is due out in December. I haven't seen this yet, but it's coming very soon. All you need to get started is a hand lens, a ×10 hand lens, and a book, or maybe ID cards. These Field Study Council cards are very good. If you get into it, you end up needing microscopes, a dissecting microscope and a compound microscope. You need chemicals, little dropper bottles with bleach and potassium hydroxide in, and you need a little UV torch of the right wavelength, which is wonderful because it makes them fluoresce in lovely colours. And my last point is the British Lichen Society has a website which is a wonderful resource. So if you're at all interested in lichens, do have a look on there. You'll be amazed what's there. We also have a database of nearly 3 million records now, with distribution maps and a lot of information in it. We need a lot more local records, so get out there and get recording. Records of common species are just as important as records of rarities, and we get a lot of records of rarities sent in by the lichen experts. We don't get enough records of common species to be able to assess their distribution and how it's changing over time. So, you know, you could, even if you're new to lichens, you could make a real contribution. That is the northeast of England. The dots show you where we have records for. The white space shows you where we have no lichen records at all. County Durham is a bit of a problem. Large chunks of Northumberland, that's North Northumberland. You can see where the hot spots are. You can see where we haven't bothered to go. So there's a real opportunity to make a contribution, even if you can only record 1 or 2 species. Beware, some lichens are not what they seem. These will all fly away if you touch them. Can you see the one, this one? There's the head, there's the body, there's the wings. Wonderful camouflage. Lichens even grow on sheep.
Aww.
If, so long as the sheep stays very, very still for a very long time. Thank you. I'm sorry I've gone slightly over time, but thank you for your attention.